Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Very good afternoon. Prison inspectors say none of the young offender institutes they've checked in England and Wales are safe because of escalating violence. Chief Inspector of Prisons, Peter Clark, says young inmates are trapped in a vicious cycle which will end in tragedy unless urgent action's taken. And he says adult jails are also in crisis with staffing levels too low to maintain order. Mr. Clark is joining us now. Hello to you, Mr. Clark. Thank you for joining us. How anxious are you as a result of these checks?
Good afternoon, Kate. Well, I have to be anxious. I think anybody has to be anxious when we come to the conclusion, as we did in February this year, that there's no place in this country that we inspect, and that's young offender institutes and secure training centres, nowhere that is safe for them to be held in. I mean, that is an extraordinary position to have reached, and that's why in February I felt obliged to write to the responsible minister, Dr. Lee, to tell him of our conclusions. What
evaluation did you use to determine safe?
Well, what we do is, for many years, we've used a series of gradings, and we look at how people feel, we look at the levels of assaults, both between people who are being held and also assaults on staff. We look at a whole range of indicators, and we come to a measured judgment. And our judgment was that at that time, none of these establishments could be considered to be safe.
What sort of conditions did you find when you were taking part in this survey?
Well, what we found very often was that simply children, and many of these are children aged between 15 and 18, are simply being held in conditions that we wouldn't recognise as being suitable for people of that age. Now, whatever the circumstances that brought them into custody, the fact is that the objective is that they should go into custody, serve the sentence that has been imposed upon them, and then receive education, training, rehabilitative treatment, so that eventually they can return to the community and hopefully less likely to reoffend and more likely to become a good and contributing member of the community. That's just not going to happen when, for instance, at one place that I've inspected, every single child between the age of 15 and 18 had every meal on their own, in their cell, locked behind their door. No association whatsoever. Many of these youngsters are locked up for over 20 hours a day in their cells. Now, that's not going to engender reform and rehabilitation.
It's emotive to call them children, Mr. Clark, of course, but they have broken the law to such an extent that they have been denied their liberty. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers who are watching this afternoon would say they have to be punished, they have to be penalised as a result.
Well, yes, of course they do, and I don't deny that for a moment. And it's absolutely right that they have to serve whatever punishment has been given to them by the courts. But the way in which that punishment is carried out in places of detention, surely we should be looking to give them a better chance after they've served their sentence of being useful members of the community.
How should we interpret the line in your report where you say tragedy is inevitable?
Well, sadly, within 4 weeks of me writing that letter to the Minister in February, a young officer at a secure training centre was very viciously assaulted, nearly lost his life. And that's the sort of thing that was concerning me, that the levels of violence and the type of violence we were seeing was such that some sort of tragedy, whether a member of staff or another person being held in one of these establishments, it seems to me is almost inevitable.
So what reaction have you received from the Minister in charge?
Well, the Ministry of Justice have sent a response saying what it is they intend to do over time to increase the numbers of staff, to adopt different methods of managing behaviour and so on and so forth. Now, we don't monitor day in, day out what's happening in these establishments. We make unannounced visits. Our inspections are never announced in advance in these particular institutions. And the idea is that we can then take a snapshot of exactly what we find. And that's what we will do. So over time, we will look to see if matters have improved. If they have, we will report that. If they haven't, equally, we will report that as well.
Is it about money, Mr. Clark, or is it about a culture?
I think it's probably a combination of things. Yes, there are staff shortages in many places, but there's also a culture, because what we've seen in some places is that where there's violence, rather than thinking about a range of means of managing the behaviour of what are sometimes very challenging young people, what we need is to think more constructively than simply a negative cycle, which we've seen too far, where violence leads to more restrictions, to longer periods locked in cells. That leads to more frustration and in turn more violence. That cycle needs to be broken, and that needs some imagination, some leadership, and yes, of course, sufficient resources to enable that to happen.
OK, it's good to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much.
Not one of the youth custody centres in England and Wales is safe for children or young people. That's the shocking warning by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, who says a tragedy is inevitable and the decline in standards is staggering. Describing the men's prison system, Peter Clark says he's often appalled by the conditions in which inmates are held. The government acknowledges that prisons have faced a number of challenges and says it's taken immediate action to, amongst other things, boost the number of prison officers. Our Home Affairs correspondent June Kelly has more.
Medway Secure Training Centre in Kent, a place where young offenders are held and hopefully rehabilitated. 18 months ago, an undercover investigation by BBC Panorama shone a light on daily life in Medway.
Listen, yeah?
Teenage inmates were seen being mistreated and abused. A number of staff were sacked and the police launched a criminal investigation. Medway, then run by G4S, is now the responsibility of the Prison and Probation Service. But it's still struggling, and only last month inspectors denounced it as inadequate. And it's not alone, according to today's damning report by the prison watchdog, which says, "We concluded that there was not a single establishment that we inspected in England and Wales in which it was safe to hold children and young people. The speed of decline has been staggering." The Chief Inspector of Prisons says he was so alarmed at what was found that he alerted ministers earlier this year.
Violence giving rise to repressive regimes, more discipline, longer being locked in cells. I've seen children being held in cells for 22 hours a day, not eating any of their meals in association with other children.
When inspectors went into Feltham Young Offender Institution in West London, they found that violence was so acute that the site was unsafe for both staff and boys. Jennifer Blake, who runs an anti-gang charity, was in Feltham last month.
Their toilet systems overflowing, the stench in there, the fact that they're more afraid to be inside the prison more than outside because of the gang rivalry within inside the prison.
She began offending when she was 13 and spent 20 years involved in knife crime, drugs and robbery.
Through my own life experience, I know that I wasn't stopped and I went down the wrong path. So if these young people are not stopped, they will take it through to their adulthood and they will continue reoffending.
The Ministry of Justice said no minister was available for interview, and in a statement it said, "The safety and welfare of every young person in custody is our absolute priority, and we are clear that more needs to be done to achieve this." When it comes to adult jails, today's report warns that prison reform will be blighted without less violence, fewer drugs and more time spent out of cells. All these require additional staff.
June, the Chief Inspector of Prisons has phrased his concerns in the strongest possible terms, and he clearly feels that no one in government is listening to him.
That's right, Fiona. Peter Clark comes across today as a desperate man. And of course, he's focusing on the proposed rehabilitation of these young people. And he says it's just impossible given the conditions that they're living under. Now, the Ministry of Justice is saying that they are going to provide an extra 2,500 staff across the prison estate. But Peter Clark says it isn't just about numbers. It's also about the conditions that inmates are being held in, including some of these kids. We heard, overflowing toilets, this sort of Dickensian situation in some institutions. The Ministry of Justice is also saying that it's created a youth custody service And they say that that's a sign of the priority which is giving to this issue. But again, Peter Clark is saying that while initiatives are fine, it's all about the practicalities. For example, he says that he and his staff produce these reports. Everybody reads them, nods and agrees what he's suggesting. Yes, it should be implemented. But he said nothing ever seems to change. And that is what is really irking him. And of course, as we were hearing, he is warning that there could be a tragedy if the situation doesn't improve in young offender institutions.
June, thank you.